Welcome to Signals and Stories, 10 Years with the Vertex Project, a limited series exploring how cyber threat intelligence has evolved over the past decade. In each episode, we break down how analysts actually investigate, covering the data and the decisions that shape real-world intelligence. Stay tuned. In this episode of Signals and Stories, we're exploring the relationship between analysts and developers working side by side. How do you translate an investigative challenge into software? How do engineers build systems that support curiosity rather than constrain it? And what can each discipline learn from the other? Joining us are members from the Vertex Project's analyst and engineering teams for a behind-the-scenes conversation about collaboration, tradecraft, and the shared goal of building technology that helps people think. Stay tuned. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today. If you've been tuning into this limited series, there's a couple of new faces, but we'll start with the people that you're familiar with. Jen, why don't you kick us off? Who are you?
I'm Jen. I'm Jennifer Kolde. I'm one of the analysts here at the Vertex Project. You may know me by my handle, thesilence.
Excellent.
My name is Mary Beth Lee. I also go by my initials, MB. Also, my handle, Savage, sometimes. And I am another analyst here at the Vertex Project.
All right. And then we got our two new they're not new to the Vertex Project, but we've got William Gibb and Mike Moritz. I'll let them introduce themselves and their handles as well. Epiphyte, you want to start us off?
Yeah. William Gibb, also known as Epiphyte. That's where you'll find me in Slack using that handle. But I work as an engineer at the Vertex Project. I've worn all of the different engineering hats at the organization over the 9 years I've been here. So I've got a little bit of a history going back working with thesilence and Savage and Rain back at our Mandiant and FireEye days, all the way back to APT1 report and doing some Mandiant consulting work. So I've known and worked with our analysts and Busy and Whippet, who we've also heard on the podcast, I believe, for quite a while.
All right, Mike.
All right, Mike Moritz, aka Redox, and I'm also an engineer here at the Vertex Project, and I've been here for almost 7 years. I'm actually not from a cybersecurity background, so since the time that I've been here, I've learned a lot from our analysts and understanding this discipline and how to build software for these use cases.
Excellent. Well, the reason I thought it might be interesting to do an episode with developers and analysts is just kind of to talk about the relationship between the two entities. Because again, this is a smaller company, so I think we're a little closer knit than others. So I just wanted to get together and talk about how you find working together, what you've learned from one another, and then what can other organizations potentially take away with their own teams. So to open the discussion, I just want to know, what thoughts do folks have on, is there a disconnect between how analysts think and how software is built?
Interesting, because you'd think there wouldn't be, in the sense that they're both disciplines that are based on logic, right? If you're going to write software, you have to understand, program flow and inputs and outputs and stuff like that. And if you're an analyst, you have to have those logical and critical thinking skills. So you would think that they would be fairly similar in some ways. But my personal history with various organizations has been that we're often on very different pages because the details of those disciplines vary. So there is often a lack of understanding or some misunderstanding about what it takes to write code and what it takes to be an analyst and be proficient in your discipline. So that's where the communication becomes really important and the willingness to listen to the other side.
Yeah, and I think there's always a challenge of properly representing the user when you're building software. But I think the challenge for me has been there's such a broad array of use cases. We could be talking about physical security and then a host execution model and then cryptocurrency and then OSINT. And so, when you're building something, there's nothing that prevents me from modeling something. But that doesn't mean it's right. And so when you kind of have to enforce your own kind of mental speed bumps and work with the analysts to try to understand those use cases together, And I think the fact that we have analysts on our team means we have someone that really represents that use case, right next door. And so remembering that and leveraging that is something that, I always have to remember.
I think even besides that, like the variety of use cases, whether it's cryptocurrency or physical security or whatever else we're looking at, but there's also within each of those use cases, there's so many edge cases. One of the conversations that we so frequently have with you guys is that, do you want it to be this or that? And it's usually Jen who will be like, both. I want both options because like you need to have the ability to capture that nuance. It's not always,
It's always both.
going to be, it's not always going to be one or the other. And I think because we have the ability to talk it out and also work so closely with our dev team, like we're able to kind of have a much more flexible ability through Synapse to capture those than we might otherwise have if we were a larger team or if there was more of a divide between the analysts and the devs.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because I think that one of the things that, Tim, when you're building something, it's like you tend to focus on the primary use case, right? And these things that are kind of at the margins, you drop off. But in working with the analysts, a lot of times those things at the margin or those edge cases are actually really important or really critical. And so there are things that you actually have to discuss and figure out how you want to handle.
I think that really, brings home that our users, like for us, our users are first and foremost our analyst team and then our customers, which they kind of proxy that. But if taking a step back, like when you don't have good focus on who your users are when you're building software, it's really easy to build a big monolith that looks impressive from an engineering perspective, but it doesn't actually meet the customer's needs or the user's needs in this case. So like having that tight coupling for us really helps bring that home and actually lets us deliver software that actually does meet what they need in like a mission critical fashion. I've been on the receiving end of projects building things that is perceived to be needed by the analyst or the end user team, but they miss the mark because there's a disconnect between that engineering team and the users. Because you go through this requirements collection cycle and everything goes back into this engineering hole, and you don't have that connection. But I think we've really been able to break that division internally, at least, and we're able to make all those decisions together.
I had a question that wasn't on the outline. So when the Vertex project started 10 years ago, because again, 10 episodes for 10 years, is it analysts and developers hired in tandem, or do we know if Busy and Whippet needed developers first, then analysts, or vice versa?
I think it's a little bit of bootstrapping everything. So Busy and Whippet obviously were the founders of the company. Their first hire was a developer. I was the second hire and Gibb was the third. But we were starting from nothing. Like we were on our government contract and the contract was to go build the thing. So we needed from the get-go, obviously developers to help write the software. And then I was the guinea pig to test it and help provide guidance. And we've really been fortunate throughout the history of the company, and including some of our prior time at Mandiant, to have a development team who was willing to work closely with the analysts and analysts who were willing to work with them, and both sides being willing to listen to and respect the other. And I think not just that close-knit environment because we're a small company and we like each other and we get along, and that willingness to talk out, issues and problems and edge cases, but that mutual respect and the corresponding humility to be able to say, okay, I have my area of expertise. I know what I want to do with the data, but I don't write code, and that's probably a good thing. So I have to defer to the engineers in terms of the best way to implement the things that I'm asking for. And that ability and willingness to listen and understand where your expertise ends and another person's begins, I think has been really critical to our success.
I feel like that's also come up in so many different cases, whether it's trying to write blogs or documentation and having the ability to go back to, like right now, my current victim is infamy, going and being like, this is how I'm trying to describe this. Like, is this accurate? Or like Sysfix as well. And they're they'll come back and like, take whatever my language is, this completely butchered the technical concept behind, tombstones or whatever, and they'll like get it to something that's, accurate from a developer perspective, but also like readable and understandable from a human perspective. So like even little things like that, just making sure that we're communicating externally, things that they're accurate, to things like, some of the modeling conversations that we've had, like when we were going through the iNet service model and for redox, we thought we were going to like start we thought that we were going to like psychologically break him because we were going through it and like kept redoing aspects of it again, and we were relying on it. We were coming into it from like an analyst perspective of how would we want to be able to query things and represent things. But then one of the things that was really critical that redox was able to do is be able to say like, this is what it looks like under the hood of what you're trying to represent. So like when, we're talking about trying to figure out like how we're going to define a platform or how we're going to like define these certain aspects of it. Like this is making sure that it's both accurate from what you all are trying to do and represent, but also from like how that actually works.
I'm curious if Redox wants to comment on the whole iNet service process.
Well, I mean, I think that
for a reason.
Yeah, to me, I think that's been one of the keys and has been an interesting thing for me to observe is how the data model gets updated. And it, part of the process is not being constrained by what the existing data sources that we may have to ingest are. Like you want to look at the use cases broadly, and I'm sure thesilence and MB can speak more to that. But then at some point, there is the contact of like, okay, well, now we need to actually model real world data, and then we'll find additional edge cases, and there's these iterations. But because we're working so closely together, they're rapid. And so obviously there will be some rework in there. But ultimately, that's what leads to, I think, an end solution that we're happier with, right? Because we have those fast turns, even if we have to, do a little bit of rework in order to get there.
You were so diplomatic in that response.
No. I cannot imagine what this would be like if we did releases quarterly. Like, because we are a small team, we release, and I think we did Synapse releases the past year almost every week to every other week. And those would have either been data model updates, core technology updates, rapid power-ups, advanced power-ups. Like, if we were shipping on like a quarterly schedule, like some software applications do, or a yearly schedule, like we would be stuck with all those choices for months to years at a time. And I can't imagine the amount of pain that like people doing the implementations of our rapid power-ups and our analysts and our customers would deal with these weird modeling holes. But because we do ship so fast, we're able to actually get those updates out. And it's great to build all these things and have these discussions, but if they don't actually get out and land and people aren't using them, they're all very theoretical in a way. But one of the funnest things working here is actually like we ship, it goes out, people are actually using it. They're actually doing things with it. And that's pretty exciting, I think.
Yeah, Epiphyte, do you want to maybe talk about that a little bit? Like we have our Vertex Synapse Slack channel where we're talking with customers or Synapse users on a pretty regular basis. What's that interaction like, and how does that come back to the dev team and into how you prioritize what needs to be released and what you need to make an analyst's life easier?
So earlier I mentioned how like you can have the disconnect between your actual end users and the engineering side, and we maintain a community Slack instance so that our end users are able to interact with us directly, and we're able to speak with open source users and our commercial folks that are there as well directly. And they're able to share back, like, this is the immediate thing that I'm working on modeling, or this is the technical problem I am encountering. And they're able to get access to our analyst team to talk through, these are some of the finer points of the model. These are things to consider. And, if it's a technical problem, like they might be having the discussion with the engineer who actually built the piece of functionality that they're working with. And from a support perspective, that's really engaging. Like you're not 3 games of telephone away from the actual engineering resources and like some frontline support person. You're getting like the ground truth answers to a lot of things. And that also helps us prioritize because we know where people are having pain points, what they actually need addressed. I think, we've talked about like, modeling trains in some of the earlier podcasts. Like that was a real thing that somebody had an operational need for. And we were able to have that modeling discussion internally, get a squared up, land it in our code, and get that out the door for people to actually use. It's not some academic exercise that we're talking about in a vacuum, like happens with some other modeling standards. It's real, and that's really exciting.
What standards do you mean? Just
I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole.
One of the questions that I had on my outline is for the developers. So the question originally was, before you work closely with analysts, what assumptions did you have about how investigations happen? But to redox and epiphyte, before the Vertex project, did you work closely with analysts at previous positions? Or would you say like this is more of the opportunity where you had the chance to work more closely with analysts?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in general, this is the closest that I've worked with someone that actually represents the end user. Like often you have someone kind of proxying that role, and it's, almost a great treat to meet, if you're an engineer, to meet someone that really understands the end use case. While here, we're kind of working in that day to day. But I do have something, that surprised me, and I think it's specific to kind of this discipline, was that I had just assumed it's such a data-driven discipline that the quality of data must be very high. And there's probably lots of standardization, and that the investigations, like the final reports you see, are intimately connected to the underlying data. And all of that is gone. It's the exact opposite of what I expected. And so that's a lot of what we do, is trying to take completely different representations of, the same underlying ground truth, trying to understand what maybe a third party is saying or what they're assessing, and trying to figure out, how to model it. Since I spend a lot of my time building the rapid power-ups, that's kind of often the, the three-legged stool there is, myself, an analyst, and then some third party that we may or may not have, a close connection with. And we're trying to tease out something structured and useful out of that and make sure that we are representing it properly.
Yeah, I think to kind of follow up on that, I think back to before at Vertex project, when I was my prior life at Mandiant and FireEye, like I started out in the consulting group at Mandiant where we were doing investigations. And I remember being a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed young associate consultant and thinking like we were going to like investigate every lead 110% to completion, to perfection. But there was usually always too much to do, given the time constraints and potentially budgetary constraints from our customers, where we had to like define kind of boxes like we can only go so far and only do so much, and that very quickly was a reality check. Like you can only get so much done in a day. You can only look at so many hosts. You can only analyze so many alerts, so to speak. But I think working with Synapse, it's one of those things where like it having the ability to put that data into a structured format more consistently, more reliably, would help assist or accelerate that process a lot easier. Because like the tools that we had 15 years ago felt very kludgy. And I was always interested, like it felt like doing these investigations or doing a lot of rote stuff at the time, because these were like host investigations. And I always found myself drawn to like the actual tooling side. How can I make this better for my coworkers? How can I make this better for myself? So it was kind of a different perspective going in, because like I'd already lived part of that life and kind of veered off to the engineering track very quickly.
I think there are two things that I guess I would follow up with that. One is the impact that good tools can have, which is why I'm so grateful for our dev team and the relationship that we have with them. Even in the history just of Synapse, not, prior history at other companies, a big part of what we were trying to build and we're trying to demonstrate to our government customer is, look, analysts spend a lot of time just doing data wrangling, right? I have to go find the data in another system. I have to bring it somewhere where I can look at it and then overlay it with other data. And we're just, constantly hand creating stuff and moving things around. And to provide better tooling where instead of me wrangling data and having to figure out where it's coming from and where it's going and how can I look at it, let me as an analyst focus on doing the analysis, like have the data wrangling happen for me and let me focus on the part of my job that ostensibly requires my skill and expertise. So that was a huge thing. Gibb talking about his experience as a consultant and doing investigations. And I think one of the things that we found within Synapse, particularly as we've continued to expand the data model and the potential use cases, is that the experience that our engineers have from their background prior to coming to Vertex has really been critical. MB and myself and Ryan all come from a threat intel focused background, and we're able to, research and learn new things, right? But having engineers who come from a financial background, like when we start to implement things like trust and safety or know your customer or cryptocurrency, people who have actually worked in those disciplines and written code for those applications is invaluable, because I don't, my background on that is next to nothing. So the developers aren't just contributing their software skills, they're also contributing their real world knowledge and experience as we continue to expand the product.
There's no such thing as a real standard for what a URL is, because malware will do all the horrible things you never want to try to parse it and make happy with. That's my token takeaway there from background experience. Take that or leave that, Callie.
I was also wondering, has there ever been a moment where there's a problem, analyst, that you've been trying to solve, but you don't know what the technical solution would look like? Like, how do you two entities work together to try to solve that problem?
I feel like we come up against that quite a bit when we're working with third-party APIs, quite frankly. Redox had mentioned how he kind of had this dream of good data being a certain way or being accessible, and that kind of came crashing down when he, joined Vertex project. And there will be times where we'll be trying to put together, whether it's a power up or just like ingesting data from a certain source, and we're coming up against some of the challenges that thesilence mentioned with tooling, where we're wrangling the data so much more than we need to. We're not sure, like, where did this come from? What exactly is this relationship to, that other piece of data? And we're going back and forth with whoever the developer is who's kind of working on that power up and trying to figure out how we can represent it given what we know, and often going back to whoever's data it is and saying, like, can you find out more information, or like, what exactly does it mean when it says that this is, linked to this? Like, how is it linked? Is there anything else that we can get from that? And sometimes they don't know, or they're not able to provide additional information. That's just how the data is structured. And so frequently in those cases, we're working with the developers. I'm like, given the limitations that we have, like, what is the best way that we can represent this that kind of gives the analysts who will be using this like as much clarification as is possible, which sometimes is not as much as we would like, but that's just what we have given the sourcing.
I'm continually amazed, again, with this partnership that we have with our engineers, not, the mutual respect, the collaboration, like all of that is really key. But I think we're honestly convinced that our engineers can do magic. Because pretty much, there is almost no problem that we can come up with that they can't ultimately find a solution for. which is amazing. Like we could just be like, I just need it to go faster, and they'll figure out a way to do that. Or we'll bring our problems or our nitpicks and say like something about this UX, like I'm just not able to do the thing, or it would be better if it did this other thing. And I'm certainly not a UX designer. And our UX engineers will come back with something. And I'm like, that is just so elegant and amazing. And I never would have thought of that. And I often think about the development process in the same way I used to think about my network security career, which is network security is one of those disciplines where nobody notices when you're doing your job well. And then as soon as something goes wrong, everybody knows who you are. And I feel like software design is similar in that if your design is elegant and functional and frictionless, nobody really notices, right? Because it just works. It's when you hit those snags or those problem points or the pointy bits that you notice it because it's blocking you from doing your job. And we rarely run into those. And when we do, we say, hey, like, let's talk about a way we can make this easier. And our devs do magic and make it happen, which is awesome.
I mean, we're like we appear to make magic. We still can't solve the halting problem for you though. So yes, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's usually
magicians.
And I think that's usually the back and forth is that the analysts or, one of our customers will have a pain point, maybe something that they're trying to do that they can, or maybe there's some friction. And that's often our discussion is there's some of these foundational principles within Synapse around consistency and deconfliction and strong typing and et cetera. And so we try to distill those use cases down into something that works within those constraints in the platform and then try to figure out, is this a primary use case? How much magic should happen? How much manual effort? How much awareness do you want to give to the user versus just kind of, again, doing all the things magically in the background? And so, again, I think that's another case where it could be something pretty internal in the guts, but there's still a back and forth with the analyst to understand how to kind of fit that use case.
I think there's also kind of the interesting intersection there of like engineers using the platform to do things and analysts using the platforms to do things, where the analysts might want to be hand bespoke doing their analysis and curating their data sets. Then you have engineering shaped users that are, I want to try to throw a million things into Synapse every 5 minutes, and they're wondering why things break down after doing that for nonstop for 3 weeks straight. And it might come down to like, I don't necessarily understand some technical aspect of the platform. And we might have to explain to them, oh, your queries are actually are like n squared because they were fast when you started. But now 10 million items in, that query takes a long time to run because you weren't properly constraining a lift somewhere, doing something. Having those discussions is always that balance of how much awareness do people have or not have about the platform, and how much awareness what's the balance in overloading users with too much technical information. And it's almost always like a person by person assessment, because we don't want to scare anybody away by like, here's jars of computer science language. But at the same time, that's how some of these things fundamentally come down to. Like you can have a query that ends up reflecting, and if you don't address that, suddenly your performance falls apart. And that does require a little bit of back and forth usually to understand what's going on and how to address it. And even just like the short stories that I just generated today look like good technical explanations that would be useful for people just to understand what's going on in the background. I might be previewing a potential blog post down the road, but having an awareness of what's actually going on is ultimately useful for people at different levels of their interaction with Synapse, either from like a DevOps perspective. I'm the engineer trying to load data in for my analysts, or I'm the analyst who want to understand what's going on when I type a storm query and how do I get data back.
And maybe just like from a tenure perspective, how has the understanding of Synapse changed, do you think, over the past 10 years? Do you feel like people are more understanding of it, or still have questions? Like, what's been the general, for lack of a better word, vibe?
I mean, 10
For the
years
community?
ago. Yeah.
For the community, Callie, or for
Yeah, I
us
think
internally?
for the community. Well, actually, you know what? Let's do both. Like for you guys and for the community. We'll start with you guys.
Analysts always want both.
Yeah.
I'm amazed just to see how it's evolved. We started out again in the early days, government contract. This was before, we were a commercial company, just building it from the ground up. Everything was command line, no UI. You kind of had to have this mental map in your head of the data model because, there was not a great way to visualize it. Going to having, a full blown UI, looking at all of the features that have been built in. So going from just an intelligence platform to having things like Spotlight and Stories and the Storm Editor and the Learning Tool, and all of the other things that that we've baked in over the years. We used to joke internally that Synapse is not one application; it's actually like 10 that we just all kind of package together. So the growth and not only the growth itself, but being able to grow and add those features and still have the platform remain consistent and usable and performant, right? Like, I don't think the quality of the software has gone down because we've added features. I think it's, maintained that same level of quality and performance with extra bonus stuff added in, which I think is a big testament to our engineering team.
Yeah, I think 10 years ago, like Synapse was a research project that was part of Vivisect disassembler toolset that then got parted out, and then that got used as the basis for earlier government contracts, and then the platform that we all know and love today. And it's been really great and really fun to see that platform grow. Working on the back end is a little bit of a different because I see it's like this application toolbox to build things with. A lot of the development team, like we've built our own like little microservices for ourselves based on parts of Synapse. Like I've got Discord bots that have been running for years without having to touch them that are still running core Synapse code to run bot services. Redox has done work with like surf times. I've done data modeling for Vineyard data to help my spouse with her PhD with it. So it's really fun to see all these use cases. But if we look outward to a community 10 years ago, Synapse, it was this research tool that like a handful of people knew about at FireEye. And now it's this toolkit that people will reach for first when they have threat intel analysis problems. And they do that because somebody told them about it because their coworker worked with it at a job and it is the best thing since sliced bread for them. And that is so cool to think about, that like we get to work on something that's been that changing for such a large community of folk.
I think another thing that I would add is that I feel like early on people thought that Synapse was just a new iteration of its predecessor, Nucleus. But I feel like now that people use it, and especially like the way that it's evolved, like Epiphyte mentioned with Redox's, surf forecast and his, modeling Vineyard data. There's so many modeling. There's so many
We're
more
getting to the
use
weather
cases.
anymore. Somebody asked for weather recently, I think.
Yeah.
There's so many more use cases, and I feel like it's just, especially now, just become so much more than. Granted, I'm very biased, and my memory of Nucleus is not up to date at all because that was a long time, and my brain doesn't hold information for long. But I feel like it's a very different beast than Nucleus was.
I think one cool thing about Synapse is we really felt like from the beginning, like everyone at this company is so passionate about what we do. Like, and that sounds really cheesy, but it's true. And we wanted to develop Synapse to give people better tools because we didn't think that anything existed on the market to do what we felt we were capable of doing. So I think part of seeing the change in the community was going from, oh, it's just another tip. I know everybody at Vertex hates when people say that, to, oh my God, I never knew you could do analysis like this. And hopefully bringing something that shows people a completely different way. And I mean that literally, to think about data and think about analysis and think about how you can work with both of those things. So we sometimes talk about a light bulb moment where you show people Synapse and they're like, yeah, okay, whatever. It's just another analysis tool, holds on my data, lets me tag my indicators, whatever. And then at some point something clicks and it's literally like a light bulb moment where people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this was possible. And that's been really gratifying to see. And to see some of the work and the reporting and the analysis that some of the people using the software have been able to produce based on that. So like Gibb said, like that gratification of having someone take something that we've built and really be able to excel, through using it. So it's a huge part of why we do what we do.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the interesting things to observe just over the last 7 years is how much work we've put into enabling power users on the platform who are often analysts to actually manage the platform directly, because speed is critical for them to enable some workflow. Like 7 years ago, if you wanted to deploy a power up that ingested virus total data, you needed a Docker container. You needed to talk to your DevOps team to get that updated and manage it. And now we have rapid power ups. Like that concept didn't exist, right? 7, 8, 9 years ago. And that's something that a power user can update. They can look at the change logs. And, I think that that kind of persona, that power user, has become so central in the engineering and building of products. And I think just early on when we were in the government contract, that wasn't as clear because we were managing a lot of it ourselves, or there was just, maybe an engineering team on the other side that was much more directly engaged.
What's interesting about what redox brings up is that power user, and I guess it kind of ties into the whole theme of this episode, is that engineer versus analyst versus engineer and analyst contrast. And I think in a lot of ways our power user kind of bridges that, right? Like we've written the product in such a way that as a power user, if I know enough about the platform and I know enough Storm, I can do kind of, devy engineering kind of tasks. And I'm not great at it, but I can write ingest code. I could probably write a super lame power up that wouldn't, be clean and tested and you wouldn't want to deploy it necessarily. But kind of enabling both sides to bridge that gap, right? So as an analyst, I can write code in Storm. As an engineer or a DevOps person, with enough exposure to Synapse, I can decide I want to learn more about the data model, or I can engage more in terms of, how my users are leveraging the platform. So it's kind of like that meet in the middle, which is really cool.
Yeah, should I call this episode Icky Group Hug?
Icky Group Hug.
Savage will make a face if you do.
Well, we always joke like we're just going to frog boil analysts into writing code, because Storm, it's this very simple query language at first. Like, inet fqdn equals vertex.link. Like that's where you start. But like we have people that have written like decoders to decode like malware family configurations. I've written a virtual machine in Storm once. It wasn't the fastest thing, but it worked. It was Turing complete. Like you can do a lot, and then you've got all those management aspects too. You want to run a backup of a service. You want to connect to another service to talk to something. You can run Storm inside of Storm. It is such a expressive language that you can do quite a bit with. And that's something that I don't think everybody really groks right up front, because that is a really big thing to internalize. But you could write your own power up in Storm. You could write a power up in Storm and install it with Storm. And the silence, if you want to write a power up and we have a dev deployment you can do that with. Like, there's nothing stopping you.
It's not on production, right? Just don't put it on production.
Different environments.
Don't break things. Or break it in a fork. Just break it in a fork.
Break it in a fork. You can always throw away a fork.
Yeah.
And the analysts have frog boiled us into modeling. Like, there will be times where we're doing an engineering review and it's like, I don't know what the right answer is, but I know that this is probably wrong and we should probably talk to an analyst. Whereas some things are like, oh yeah, that's a no-brainer. That's obviously a tag with this hierarchy, and so that's been really critical as well. And they're very nice and kind to us.
They are.
You guys are very nice and kind to us.
I do one modeling task a year. I'm sorry, I spoke over you.
No, I say, like, you guys are kind to us every time we ask for something crazy. So,
what's the craziest thing you've asked for?
There probably have been so many over the years. Like the one problem that we have not yet been able to solve. Not that it's not solvable, but from what I understand, it would require a crazy amount of back-end indexing that we're not willing to do. Is please tell me which net blocks this IP belongs to. And redox is laughing. Like, devs can probably explain it better, but we get that ask. We've made it. We get it from customers a lot, and that is apparently one of the biggest hard problems that, like I said, it's not unsolvable, but the level of effort to solve it is not yet been prioritized, I guess.
Yep. It's interval indexing. It's an expensive thing to do. And that we always have to do trade-offs. Like, it's engineering. Like, you have to make decisions. Like, what's the value in making that particular index, that trade-off for a performance perspective? And that's always the devil's in the details. We can index all of the things all of the time, but that doesn't help if those questions aren't being asked all the time, and it takes the performance of the system down by 25%. We want to value at least the best possible experience we can give to all of our users. We'll get interval indexing one day, I'm certain. We'll get it sorted out.
Now that 3.0's landed, right? You guys have all this time.
Yeah, we have the breathing room to do that now. So we went GA yesterday. I don't know when this podcast is going to get recorded, but or get posted. Sorry.
The developers haven't slept for a week. Like, everybody's just.
Yesterday is, like, for listener's sake, when we recorded this, yesterday was August 13th. So that's when we went live.
No, but I think, pretty much anything crazy that we've asked for, they've done for us. Like, the learning tool is an example, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I won't go into like details and specifics, but that's incredible. It could be an entire standalone application. And it, they just wrote it up and it does all this cool stuff. And we're able to develop, training materials and workshops directly integrated with Synapse and Synapse's data store and run those, which is just incredible. And to kind of go back a little bit to the engineers and the analysts in one big icky group hug. One of the brilliant things that I think, love you, Gibb, that we've been able to achieve with the platform is to accommodate that full spectrum of users. We have people that are intimidated by Storm or think it's hard or just don't want to learn it for whatever reason, right? Like, my level of efficiency relates to me being able to point and click at things faster. That's great. We have brilliant people who have designed a front end that lets you do that and lets you automate stuff and access things from menus instead of having to write queries on your own, all the way to that power user who wants to write their own queries and macros and power-ups and so on. And I think we've pulled off the miracle of, being able to accommodate that full spectrum, which again is super incredible and is a testament to our engineering team. So love you guys.
Yeah, I think the one that seemed crazy to me back in the day, but no longer seems crazy because now I've been frog boiled into it, would be small changes to the data model that to me seem almost insignificant and would require migrations and updates and all of this stuff. And now it's like I understand the criticality of that. And I think part of it is because kind of the design principle with our UI is that you're looking at the actual data, right? There's not an abstraction layer that's taking the data and then doing a bunch of munging, right, to show you the end result. And so if there's a property name that is no longer accurate, we are going to create a new property name and deprecate the old one and migrate the power-ups and update the documentation because, that's important where maybe in some other use cases, right, the UI would just change the name on the front end and you'd never be the wiser of it, right, if you didn't have to access the backend data. And so I think, a lot of those small data model changes and not being afraid to update that and migrate things when necessary now just seems kind of, part of what we do. And I think it's important and allows us to stay up to date with use cases without having to do big major releases. Obviously, V3 is a big one for us, but there's been years of changes in V2 that I've done.
I think the other hand, besides the requests that we make of the devs that may or may not be crazy or big lifts or things like that, there's also, I feel like we have the benefit of working closely enough that it's like we won't make requests, but the devs will see something that will be a need. For example, there's been like multiple times where I've been either like demoing something internally and say like, Infamy, who's one of our devs, will ping me afterwards and be like, oh, I noticed that there was like, one or two things that you navigated around that we can fix. And there are things that like I never knew to ask about that we could fix because to me they didn't register as a problem, but because, he is a developer and that these are things that he looks for, like how can I make this easier for the analyst, like seeing how you're using it and what you're doing. And I feel like there's a lot of that goes on as well, where because we work closely together, it's not even that we have to be able to necessarily identify things that we need or need to be changed just to even make things a little bit smoother. We can rely on somebody else's expertise to notice it and fix it.
All right. Maybe I will end on this question because I know we're almost approaching an hour, but what do you think is the feature or element that you're most proud of collaborating together and getting that into Synapse?
There's so much.
That's a big list.
I know.
Yeah.
I would probably, I'm putting my engineering hat on here. I would probably say the overall collaboration and work that we've done for all of the Storm library and type system and all that functionality that's exposed for our users and analysts. Like it's all the APIs, like I mentioned earlier. Like you can just start with a simple lift, but once you want to start to do more and more complex things, I want to reach out and grab data from an HTTPS endpoint. I want to read a file from the Axon, or I want to store a file there, or I want to do some crazy string encoding, or I need to parse a XML document. We've got such a rich system for that, and it's like such a valuable toolkit. And getting that built has been, I think, a really valuable thing for our users.
Yeah, I would probably say, I think, maybe the silence, I don't know if the silence will agree with me on this, the threat intel workflow for a couple specific reasons. So one is that that was really the first workflow. And that was an entirely new subsystem that we were building so that power-ups could deliver custom UX. And that's what allows customers to be able to do that same thing. So you can create your own modals and different workflows, and it's been super powerful. But that was the first one and required, obviously, the engineering to build the workflow, also engineering to be building the subsystem as we're going and developing this, and then working with the analysts to figure out how to visually represent all of these relationships in the data model. And I think that we knew it was going to be useful, but it seemed to really land with customers. And so I think it was just cool, that collaboration, but also using that to kind of launch this new functionality and then have it be immediately useful.
Yeah, that was huge. That was a big lift. And there's a couple of drivers behind that. One was to make it easier to work with GUID forms, which can have their own unique aspects if you're trying to do everything in Storm in terms of working with them and visualizing them and linking them together. So it was done partly to simplify that process so people didn't have to use Storm to do it if they didn't want to. But major props to Redox for taking that on, because it wasn't just like, well, we want a couple of tabs to do a few simple things. It's like, no, we have this whole complex sub part of the data model that has to do with threat intel and techniques and what software people use and who they target and stuff like that. And we need like 87 different tabs to allow us to cross-reference these from any direction possible. And he's like, yeah, sure, I can build that for you. So that was really cool. I would probably say the data model itself. And it's partly because we've been up to our eyeballs in the data model as part of the 3.0, rollout. Is like sanity checking it and what do we want to change and what doesn't work and what would we do differently if we had to do it over. But as an analyst, right, there's a lot of engineering that makes up the heart of Synapse, right? That's critical to how it works and why it works really well. What's most visible to me as an end user is the data model and the love and care that goes into that, both from the design side, which is a mix of engineers and analysts hashing that out on a weekly basis as to what that should look like and what we should build into it and what we should change. But also, as Redox mentioned, the willingness to make small changes when we realize we didn't do something, quite the way we should have, and support that to keep it correct. We always want it to properly reflect reality, to keep it useful to the analysts, to keep it as intuitive as we can make it in terms of naming conventions and how things are shaped and how I understand I'm supposed to use it. And in addition to the engineering, the data model is what enables the whole platform, right? I can't analyze data. I can't query data and understand relationships if that data model isn't optimized to allow me to do that. So that's been huge. And then I guess we defer to MB and see what she thinks our greatest achievement is.
I think I am going to have to choose the analyst answer and be like, yes, both of them, all of them. Gibbs' answer was like very Debbie, so I don't know if I'm necessarily going to go with that one.
I was thinking of some of our like power user customers that have use cases that are enabled by that wide API surface.
I think that all of the answers, though, like to me, what they get at is what I think Silence had mentioned earlier about being able to meet the needs of like the entire range of users, from somebody who's a power user and wants to be able to do all these things to somebody who needs to have the ability to look up threat groups and see like where we've seen them, what they've used, what they've targeted and things like that, but doesn't want to use Storm or needs to just go in and look something up or needs to go in and be able to capture relationships without necessarily having to know Storm. Just making the entire power of the system accessible to them. And however they're engaging with it, whether they're a power user or whether they're somebody who's not going to be using Storm. So I think those are all of the examples that you all listed, I think, play a fundamental role in that.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. I really appreciate your time. This was the penultimate episode of Signals and Stories. So we've got one more to go in our 10-year anniversary podcast series. And our final episode, Busy and Whippet, will be back closing the series. If you've enjoyed these conversations, please be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and be sure to visit vertex.link/10-year anniversary to explore the rest of the series. We will catch you in the next episode, and thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to Signals and Stories. If you found this episode useful, be sure to follow the series and share it with your team. For more on how the Vertex project approaches intelligence, from data modeling to real investigations, visit vertex.link. We'll see you in the next episode.